So let's get started. We have a couple webinar objectives today that we wanted to highlight for you all. The first is to develop or deepen participant understanding of the EPP literacy proposal process, and also to familiarize participants with the EPP literacy proposal template requirements and rubric criteria. If you're new to this process, meaning that you were not actively part of the early elementary and special education drafting or submission process, some of this will look very new. If you have experienced some of that process from the first round of endorsements, then some of this will look familiar to you, and we'll try to highlight those connections as we move through this webinar. Before we get deep into our agenda, I am here with a few colleagues from the Tennessee Department of Education. I'm going to give them a moment to introduce themselves. We'll start with Lindsay.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Nelson, and I am the EPP Literacy Consultant, and I've joined Annie in navigating the literacy proposal process.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Derline. I'm the Executive Director of the Office of Educator Licensure and Preparation. We appreciate your time today and look forward to digging into this with you.
Hi, this is Hank Staggs. I'm a member of the Teacher and Leaders Division here at the department. I also work with the Governor's Academy for School Leaders and the Tennessee Transformational Leadership Alliance, and then I'll also be working with Leadership Prep.
Thanks, everybody. Let's dig into our agenda today. We're going to provide for you a brief overview of the literacy proposal process and talk a bit about the proposal structure, but spend the bulk of our time talking about the expectations outlined in our comprehensive questions as well as in the rubric criteria. We'll go through each question by question and provide some drafting guidance, as well as highlight the rubric expectations that will be used to evaluate each question. We really highly encourage all EPPs to have the rubric expectations while they are drafting responses to ensure that they're thinking about those expectations as they continue with that drafting process. We'll finish up the webinar today by talking a bit about the review process and what that entails, as well as briefly talk about the submission process, the latter of which we will go into detail at our October 29th Literacy Network meeting. So just a bit of a reminder in some context, the EPP Literacy Standards for instructional leaders were approved by the State Board of Education in 2017. These standards are located in the Educator Preparation Policy, that's 5.504. We encourage you, if you have not located these standards yet, to go to our tn.gov/SBE site, the State Board of Education website, and access those standards within the policy through that website. And as a reminder, these literacy standards are tightly aligned with the revised Tennessee Instructional Leaders Standards, or TILS, policy. And one thing that we heard loud and clear from the July Literacy Network meeting was the need or desire for a crosswalk between these TILS and EPP literacy standards. And we do have that document in development currently, and we think that it will be a valuable resource to provide for EPPs as they continue to think about what they're already doing in their instructional leader programs and as they're thinking about embedding the EPP literacy standards throughout. This crosswalk should be available for you all by the October 29th meeting. As a reminder, too, this is a one-time proposal process that's required for all initial licensure programs for instructional leaders, and it's really a process designed to allow EPPs to demonstrate how their programs are aligned to these literacy standards. Here's the timeline for standards implementation. By January 28th, 2019, proposals for instructional leader programs will be due. By March 11th, 2019, all EPPs will receive notification of proposals that either meet expectations or need for revisions. And for those of you that may be unclear with this process, this is an iterative review cycle. And what that means is that upon March 11th, if your EPP receives a need for revisions notification letter, everybody who receives that letter will have an opportunity to make revisions to their proposal and then resubmit their revised proposal in April of 2019. If, again, upon the review of that second submission, the proposals do not yet meet expectations, EPPs will be given that feedback from reviewers and given yet another opportunity to make those revisions and resubmit in June of 2019. We will provide for you specific dates in April and June as the iterative review cycle is underway. So we will provide for you those exact dates as the original submission date draws closer. The expectation is that all EPPs with instructional leader programs will implement the new standards by fall of 2019. Let's talk a bit about the proposal structure. So if you have the template in front of you, it would be helpful to be looking at that now. There are only two parts to the proposal structure for instructional leaders. Part one is the standards alignment, and part two is the comprehensive questions. I want to spend a little bit of time talking through the standards alignment, or part one of the proposal template here. On that template, you'll see a repeated table that looks like this that is meant for EPPs to fill out for each instructional leader core course to demonstrate alignment to the EPP Literacy Standards. We've gotten a question quite frequently about how deeply we're looking at these terms that we have here for standards 1 through 10, which include standards being introduced, standards being assessed, reinforced, and then integrated within practice. My advice here is to just not overthink these terms. What we're looking for here is sort of a dual purpose. This document here for standards alignment shows the breadth of coverage of standards across the instructional leader program. And so as you complete this table, the first thing that you'll do on the left-hand column, column A, is you'll list the title and the prefix of the course name. So for example, Education 401 may be your Introduction to Instructional Leaders course. And then in column B, you'll, for each standard that's indicated here, 1 through 10, you'll select either that the standard is introduced, assessed, reinforced, or integrated within practice, or you'll select NA if that standard is not covered at all. There's also the option if a standard is both introduced and assessed, then you can select both of those for the particular standard. In column C, we see the term candidate assessment, and we encourage EPPs to think about that word assessment broadly. What we're thinking here is that each of these standards, if they're covered in a course, should be assessed in some way. It may be formally, it may be informally, but what we're asking for in this column is the evidence that would show through just naming the particular candidate assessment or task what will be used to essentially ensure that candidates within that course have the opportunity to present their knowledge of that standard within the course. So again, we don't want to overthink the terms introduce, assess, reinforce, integrate within practice. You can select more than one option within that middle column, but we do want to ensure that there's coverage of all 10 of those standards somewhere within the courses. I'm going to pause here and just take a moment to see if participants have any questions about what has been covered so far. All right, we don't have any questions at this time, so I will move forward and we will begin talking about the comprehensive questions and rubric expectations. So there are 4 comprehensive questions that we require on this proposal, And you can see these laid out here in sort of broad terms. Question 1 will focus on the literacy preparation within the program sequence. Question 2 about school culture and environment. And question 3 is about data-informed vision and goals. And question 4 about those data-informed resources. I want to pause here and just take a moment to talk about this term evidence that we use. This term evidence is used broadly, and evidence can be found in both the narrative responses and attachments. So what that means is all comprehensive questions require narrative responses, and questions 3 and 4 require attachments. And attachments are there to support the weight or the rationale that's provided in the narrative response. So for questions 3 and 4, we're asking for candidate assessments. That can be EPP-created candidate assessments that are there to show evidence of the response aligning to the rubric criteria for each particular question. It's important to not interchange the words evidence and attachments, because evidence, again, can be found in both the narrative responses and attachments are there as either optional or required, and we'll talk about those as we get more into the questions. So some broad guidance as you approach the drafting process. Narrative responses should present the primary argument and evidence. Reviewers will be trained to look for the bulk of the response or the evidence or adherence to the rubric criteria within the narrative response. Attachments then should be used to support the narrative responses. So for example, if you submit a candidate assessment that provides additional detail about a particular task or assignment that a candidate is doing, then that should just provide the additional detail. But again, the narrative response is really what carries the weight. Please write with the proposal requirements in mind. We know that you're doing some wonderful things within your instructional leader programs already that may very much align to what the requirements are of the proposal, but we want to try to avoid sort of retrofitting what you're already doing within the proposal requirements if it doesn't make sense to do so. So we really encourage EPPs to think first about what is the question really asking, how am I going to be assessed, and to respond to those prompts in that way. Please write for an audience external to your EPP. Reviewers will be LEA and EPP representatives. However, they may not know the ins and outs of your EPP. So it's really important that you write for an education audience, but to spell out acronyms and to be a little bit more explicit in areas that you think may need clarity. Please use those rubrics or the rubric as you are drafting those responses. And it's also important to reference helpful information found in other responses or attachments. We'll talk a little bit about that as we get into question 3 and question 4. If there's a great candidate assessment that you're using in response to question 3 that's going to tie into the requirements for question 4, please go ahead and reference those. These proposals will be reviewed holistically, which means the reviewer will have the opportunity to read across the responses for all 4 questions and provide ratings for each. So please help those reviewers essentially kind of roadmap and be real explicit about where those connections may lie. We will have some attachment and word count limitations, and we'll talk a little bit about that at the conclusion of the webinar. This is an example of the rubric. Again, if you have it in front of you, you'll be able to look at those requirements as we continue through the webinar. A couple key areas to focus your attention. At the beginning, or at the very top of the table, you'll see the question that's being asked, and then you'll see below it whether or not attachments are optional or required. Again, for question 1 in particular and question 2, attachments are optional, so you do not have to necessarily include core syllabi or program course module sequences unless you feel like they will enhance or support the argument being made in the narrative response. Each question or question part is organized into 3 columns that will be used for evaluation, and the responses will fall either in the meet, approaching, or below expectations category. For the purpose of this webinar today, we're going to focus specifically on the meets expectations language. So as we transition and talk about question 1, the question asked here, describe how the instructional leader program sequence demonstrates coherence and increases in complexity and depth over time. So here you will be thinking about your entire instructional leader program, but what the requirements of the proposal are is really helping you focus narrow your focus on the literacy preparation within the instructional leader program. So what we're looking for and trying to encourage EPPs to think about is what the literacy preparation looks like across the program. In terms of guidance for question 1, we know that strong responses will be more complex than a simple listing of programs of study. So you may begin the response of talking about how the program sequence builds in complexity by listing out the descriptions of each course, but then a strong response will go above and beyond that. It may provide that program sequence that's focused on literacy development that mirrors the standards alignment in the first part of the proposal, and simultaneously we'll talk about the intentionality behind the program design using course objective language. And again, we really see that standards alignment that we just talked about that's required for part 1 as a valuable tool to answer question 1. And as you're already engaging in conversations with your faculty about where standards are introduced, reinforced, assessed, et cetera, this is a great opportunity within the response to question 1 to highlight what the standards integration looks like and how it will build in complexity. As far as rubric expectations for question 1, one area I want to turn your attention to is, again, that increasingly complex program sequence, as well as clear opportunities for candidates to develop the knowledge of the literacy content strategies and assessments throughout. We've gotten a couple questions about the last bullet, that candidates are provided substantial opportunities to build knowledge of literacy content strategies and assessments while applying this knowledge in practice. That does not mean necessarily that while candidates have these opportunities that they require a clinical or simultaneous clinical experience. We know that these opportunities can also be built while practicing both in and outside of the classroom. Let's transition and talk a bit about question 2, which is around school culture and environment. This question asks for candidates to be provided opportunities to determine both the human and physical characteristics of a literacy-rich environment and be able to create and support a literacy-rich school culture and environment that's responsive to student differences. In providing guidance to answer this question, strong responses will provide a description where EPPs are considering the literacy-rich environments at both at the school, classroom, and district level. So even though we're targeting sort of this school environment, we know that instructional leaders will be able to think about the school by looking very carefully and specifically at what's happening at the classroom level as well as what's happening at that district level. So in terms of environment, we're really kind of thinking about it at these different levels. Strong responses will also describe the opportunities that candidates have to interact and collaborate with candidate peers, mentor leaders, and classroom teachers to ensure that this environment is really embedded across these various levels. So in looking at the rubric expectations here, one area that we've also gotten some questions is about this third bullet as well, where there is an opportunity for candidates to recognize and advocate for culturally responsive literacy practices. You can see here that there's a direct correlation with the revised TILS language here. was the inclusion of culturally responsive literacy practices. And so what we intend to do at the October 29th meeting is to give you some additional resources and readings that will help you get some practical thoughts and opportunities around what is culturally responsive literacy practices. So we just encourage you again to utilize those resources once available and to continue thinking about the overlap of the revised TILs with these EPP literacy standards as you're thinking about these requirements. Question 3 is broken into 2 parts. It does require attachments, and these attachments we imagine will be the actual candidate assessments as well as the scoring mechanisms that are used to evaluate these candidate assessments. This question asks for EPPs to submit 1 to 2 candidate assessments and to describe how these assessments require candidates to identify and use data-driven assessments based on student literacy. So this is really sort of broken into 2 parts. Part A is thinking about the analysis and interpretation of the relevant literacy data for all students, and then using that data, having the opportunity for candidates to collaboratively develop evidence-based literacy goals for the purpose of increasing student achievement. And thinking about guidance for drafting responses to 3A and 3B, we really want to, again, reiterate the importance of prioritizing the narrative responses that, again, should carry the weight of that argument and include meaningful attachments. So a syllabus may be a good attachment to provide additional support or description, but a meaningful attachment may be zeroing in on that particular part of the syllabus and including just the parts that are going to support the narrative responses. And that way, reviewers are really zeroing into that particular evidence that will be used to align to that rubric criteria. The reason why we included on back here on the question, submit 1 to 2 candidate assessments, is we see the opportunity for EPPs to develop maybe one more comprehensive assessment that covers multiple areas of question 3, or if you're really seeing these requirements as being distinctive, that there is a specific assessment that addresses each part of that question. We also encourage EPPs to think about providing specific examples to clarify how the assessments are achieving these purposes, which may or may not include scoring mechanisms. So I talked a little bit about the distinction between A and B, and again, A is the ability for candidates to analyze and interpret that relevant literacy data, and the ways that we're thinking about the rubric expectations to evaluate this requirement is that there is going to be some evidence from the assessment that candidates will demonstrate foundational knowledge of the uses and limitations of literacy assessments, as well as have the opportunity to demonstrate the ability to analyze outcomes from those literacy assessments. And again, we see this sort of as being step 1, whereas what step 2 does is that once this literacy data is available and properly analyzed and interpreted, that it can be used to collaboratively develop evidence-based literacy goals for the purpose of increasing student achievement. Evidence from this assessment will also include how candidates will translate these assessment outcomes into goals and leverage the traits of highly effective literacy teachers for supporting student literacy development. Question 4, similar to question 3, does ask for EPPs to submit at least one candidate assessment and describe how assessments require candidates to employ and manage resources to support the literacy goals and maximize student growth in literacy. And so some guidance around drafting this response is that strong responses will not only address how candidates will identify data trends or gaps, but also how they will engage with that data to make decisions about school-based resources. So they might consider how the candidates will have the ability to differentiate the human and physical resources, to provide that concrete evidence to support how candidates will employ and manage those resources, how candidates will view teachers as valuable contributors to impact student achievement and acknowledge and integrate the breadth and depth of those resources. In terms of the rubric expectations, this is really rich within the data, and that by using data, candidates are able to think about the resources that are needed to leverage those literacy goals and maximize student growth and literacy. And so there's a few bullet points here that should be included within the attachments or narrative responses for question 4. Again, very heavy within the use of data. I'm going to pause here just for a moment to see if there are any specific questions regarding the comprehensive questions or rubric expectations. Okay, we got a few really good questions here. One's really just around the term candidate assessment, and I know that we use that term frequently when we think about more standardized approaches that lead to EPP outcomes and data. We're using the term here to talk about EPP-generated candidate assessments that may be tasks. So what's being done in the day-to-day work within courses and clinical experiences that are supporting candidate development in these particular areas. So again, candidate assessments can be EPP created. That's what we're looking for this literacy proposal process. We also received a question about whether or not the slides would be available for all the webinars. Yes, absolutely. Not only will the slides be available, but so will the recording of the webinar. We anticipate getting that information out to you certainly by the next EPP update that will be published in October. But we also have the names and information from all of our literacy leads for each group of endorsements covered from this round of proposals, and we will email out these resources to those literacy leads as well. Finally, we had another question about, this is a one-time process, review process. Should we anticipate having to submit data for these later? That's such an excellent question, and one that we're really talking about internally at the department now. We are considering how these data, as well as this process, will be integrated within our comprehensive review process. So I think your focus now should be just to consider and think about program design and what these plans are for implementation in the fall. And we'll continue to provide for you information about what this will look like as it's integrated within the comprehensive review process as that continues to be developed. Okay, I'm going to transition us and talk just briefly about the review process. So this will be familiar for those of you who have engaged in the first round of reviews. For those of you who have not, this may be new information, but each proposal will be reviewed 3 times by external reviewers. So as these are submitted in January, they will be given to at least 3 reviewers that will be trained through, that will include both EPP and LEA representatives that will be provided extensive training. And the reviewers will review each proposal holistically, and each reviewer will provide a rating for each one of the questions, and then that information gets provided back to the department, and then we provide a notification letter for each program that states which questions meet expectations and which questions require revision. So therefore, if your proposal comes back meeting expectations, we will provide for you the specific information that's needed so that you will only have to revise the questions that did not meet expectations. If you had, say, 2 out of 4 of the questions meet expectations, you will not be required to review or revise those questions that did meet. Again, reviewers will rely heavily on their rubric to score each question per proposal, and all documents will be redacted. One ask that we have for you is that to ensure a blind review, we really encourage EPPs to remove any identifiable information as they are drafting responses. That means not including any EPP logos or email addresses that have the EPP's name or any faculty names, emails, or phone numbers, because again, this is actually a double-blind process in that EPPs submit these proposals, reviewers do not know which EPP they have received, and similarly the EPP will not know what reviewer has reviewed their proposals. So we just ask for your support in ensuring that all documents have that identifiable information removed. In terms of our submission process, we'll provide a lot more detail about the submission process first at our October 29th meeting, and we'll also have a guidance document published for this as well as we get closer to the January deadline. We do use the file sharing server, Dropbox, and as we get closer, we'll have developed for each EPP a Dropbox folder that they will use to submit their proposal documents, and that can be shared within the institution so that those who are working on their proposals can have access to that submission platform. We encourage all EPPs that as they're drafting to use the template that is our fillable PDF, that if anything is completed on, say, like a Word document that is part of the narrative responses, we will send it back and ensure that all those narrative responses are captured on our fillable PDF template. If you are submitting any attachments, particularly for questions 3 and 4, we ask for you to save all files as PDF. Please adhere to the narrative word count limits as described on the proposal template, and we will provide for you in upcoming guidance language attachment limitations and naming conventions to use. We want to ensure that when you are providing attachments, you're not submitting, say, 50-page syllabi, not that anybody would necessarily, but we want to avoid reviewer fatigue and really support EPPs in thinking concisely about responding to each question. So in terms of next steps, we are hosting our October 29th Literacy Network meeting on that date from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Central Time. Will be hosted at the Cool Springs Marriott in Franklin. There has been a registration link that has gone out to your faculty leads for this round of endorsements. We encourage that each EPP bring 2 to 3 representatives for all proposals required in this round. So that would include our ELA middle and secondary, and then our non-ELA middle secondary, and pre-K-12 and CPE groups as well. There will be ample time at this meeting for you all to engage in examples that will provide for you, not exemplars, but examples to start thinking about some narrative responses to these questions and to really navigate that rubric criteria and to think deeply about it as you begin that drafting process. We'll also provide time for you to ask questions of PDOE staff and, more importantly, to network with other EPPs across the state who are all engaging in this drafting process together. So please make plans to attend, and again, we can accommodate between 2 and 3 per EPP across all of those endorsement areas. Of course, we're here for any questions that you may have. You can email me or Lindsay at the provided email addresses. We're also happy to hop on the phone with you if you have any more detailed questions as you begin that drafting process. We also really encourage you all to think about spreading the word about both these webinars as well as the Literacy Network meeting to ensure that you are helping your faculty who are also engaging in the drafting process in these different endorsement areas and keeping them aware of what resources are out there, because we just really want to provide as much support as we can, as we know how busy you all are and how this timeline is going to be here sooner than later. So we will go ahead and wrap up our webinar for today. Again, these slides and the link to the webinar will be available as soon as we can make it. It'll be definitely out in our October edition of the EPP update. And again, we have plans to send out these resources to literacy leads or to faculty leads for this round of endorsements as soon as these are made available. So in the meantime, please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions or comments that you have, and we're happy to navigate those in the meantime, and we really look forward to seeing you all at the October 29th Literacy Network meeting.